If research in education is an attempt at explaining pieces of a complex system of interactions between factors on the process of learning and the social organization set up to support it, then theoretical frameworks help describe these systems. So what is a theoretical framework? Well, first, as you decide to enter into a research project, you first define the domain of study. Defining the domain of study basically is to define the discipline that you will be working in, and then going and examining the literature in that area. As you examine the literature in that area, current articles, old articles, the more you look at the current articles, the more you will see the kinds of problems that are being studied at the moment. As you see these studies and as you see the kinds of problems they're studying, you will define what your own problem is, what the problem that you want to look at is. It may be based in part on literature, it may be based in part on personal experience, it may be a situation that you are wanting to resolve, it may be a problem that you are trying to solve in your own school system. But the Lit Review will help you do two things. A, it'll help you define what that problem is, see if it is current, and it will also help you see if there are other problems or other studies have looked at the same problem. Once you've determined what the problem is, you then need to define a theoretical framework. Theoretical framework is the part that we will be looking at, and is the part that will help you then decide on not only on the methodology that you'll be using, but exactly what you will be studying and exactly how you will be doing it. So, theoretical framework, what is it? Well, it's a logically structured representation of all the concepts, the variables, and the relationships involved in the scientific study you wish to do, with the purpose of clearly identifying what will be explored, examined, measured, or described. So, in that Lit Review, what have you read? You need to make a database, you need to collect, you need to aggregate, you need to make sure that you have access to everything that you have read in a structured manner, and then you need to be able to clearly write what the basic problem you wish to study is. You need to be able to write it in such a manner where all the concepts will be very clearly identified. And how you do this is in the problems that you will have picked up from the literature or the one you have written. What are the important words and what are the concepts that they refer to? Identify the key concepts. Once you've identified these key concepts, identify the words that relate to them, then define these based on what you have read and reference everything. Don't forget that your definition should answer these following questions. A, what is the exact nature of that concept? What is the purpose of the function or the function of this concept? What purpose does it serve? And finally, how does it work? Or what are the processes involved in this concept? For example, then you take these concepts and you would want to put them together in a diagram. For example, I could be looking at the introduction of a new technology of some kind in a classroom context, and I would also want to be looking at the pedagogical approaches that will be used along with the introduction of these new technologies. These two concepts become my independent variables. As I describe these independent variables, I then will be inevitably looking at, well, what kind of effect will these concepts have, will these two variables have on what? Well, on for example, ultimately I want to see what effect they will have on learning, but in the meantime I also want to look at specifically what effect they would have on motivation, since motivation itself has an impact on learning. So my concept 3 becomes motivation, my concept 4 becomes learning. The learning becomes my final dependent variable, whereas the motivation becomes an intermediate variable, a variable that has a direct impact on my dependent variable, but is also directly impacted by the other two, which may not have direct impact on learning. Finally, there may be another kind of variable that I want to look at, or factor, and these are the kinds of variables that have an effect on, but are not necessarily part of the system. For example, an effect on motivation could be, are the children well fed? Are they from a socioeconomic sector, or is your school in such a sector where the kids come in hungry in the morning, or have stressful family environments? That would all have effects on motivation independently of the introduction of the computers in the classroom, or the new technologies, the mobile devices, or independently of the pedagogical strategy that you would employ. These factors would have direct impact on motivations, which in turn would affect what you would be measuring at the end in terms of your dependent variable, or the learning the children are doing in any specific area. This kind of simple theoretical framework can be far more complex. You can have other concepts that have impact on other concepts, and sub-concepts that co-vary with others. And these theoretical frameworks can become fairly complex. What is important is that all the concepts be very clearly identified, very clearly defined, that you decide very clearly from the offset which ones are independent variables, which ones are intermediate variables, which ones are dependent variables, and which are factors that could affect any of these in the process that you need to take account of when you will be doing your actual study, because they will have some impact. Having done all of this, you are then ready to start writing. So as a quick recap, write your general problem based on the literature you have read and from the problems you have seen in literature, and based on the problems that you have seen either in your own classroom, school, or whatever. Write a research question or research questions. Write these questions very clearly. Make sure that you can identify all the key concepts in this question. So if in the question I want to see what is the impact of introducing mobile devices in a constructivist pedagogical approach on the motivation of children, or on learning mathematics, then you need to identify all these variables and all these key concepts. Make sure you've defined each of these concepts in your text. Definitions with literature support, of course. Identify the existing or potential relationship between these concepts, in the sense that if you're going to say that the introduction of new technologies will have impact on motivation, make sure you've got something in literature that will support that will say, yes, some experiment somewhere has been done that demonstrated that this kind of technology in this kind of context had this kind of impact on motivation. And finally, make sure that you're able to identify what indicators you'll be studying and how you'll be looking at these. In the sense that if you're going to be looking at the motivation, are you going to look at motivation since it's not something you can see in the learner's head? Is it something you're going to measure by the amount of time they spend on a task, on the kind of enthusiasm they show while they're working, the kind of product they will be putting out? What are the indicators you'll be looking at when you want to measure, for example, motivation? So all of these elements need to be part of your theoretical framework, because they are the ones that actually will then decide and help you decide exactly on the methodology you will be using for your research study.